So before we start, let's kind of just recap and talk about ethics in regards to knowing what you're moving forward with. And we're going to talk a little about a survey that we did on ethics. So ethics is performance-based, it's expectation-based. And those measures of performance and expectations lead us into the ethical behaviors that we do.
Thanks, Sandy. So talking a little bit about the best practices publication. A best practice is a legacy product of the foundation, and we've done numerous of these over the years. Over the last year, we've really worked hard to establish clear criteria for the development of the best practice, and so we use that criteria as we moved forward with this newest publication on ethics. And so one of the things that we did is we decided we were going to reach out to a couple of the large interest groups, CEOs and large-scale managers, and ask you some questions about how you are administering ethics within your own organizations today. And we got some very interesting information. So first of all, this is a sample of our participants, and it's about 50-50. We have about 50% management company CEOs and about 50% large-scale managers, a few others which were executives within large companies. When we look at how many had an AMS or a PCAM, it's about 3/4 of our participants had that designation and the others did not. And there's an interesting correlation between this slide and our next, which is how many of their organizations had code of ethics, and it matches almost exactly with those that had designations. So we certainly see that, that having the CAI designations has an influence over the perspective, or at least the awareness of the necessity to have a code of ethics. So then we asked them what kind of code of ethics they used. Did they just use the CAI document, or did they go further and create something on their own? And you can see it's about 50% chose to just use the CAI code of ethics as their base document, while the other 50% kind of went beyond and created something on their own. So now we're going to compare some of the results side by side. Do you use a code of ethics in your new employee orientation? You can see that those results are very similar. Okay, they're very similar. How frequently do you review the code of ethics with your management team? Now, the purple bar that you see says no set schedule. So you can see that that was the definitely the #1 response from both sides, followed closely by annually. And then there's a little bit that never, said never, and a little that said monthly. Now, one of the things that we explore in the best practices is, what's the ramifications of no set schedule or as needed? And the ramifications of that are it's going to be too little, too late. And as Sandy mentioned, ethical conduct and ethical issues don't necessarily wave a red flag when they're coming at you. There are things that look pretty benign on the front end, or maybe just a little questionable, and then they develop as time goes on. And if you have an employee that's inexperienced or has not been made aware of what the code of ethics is, it'd be very easy for them to make a misstep. And so education is real important in the overall process. How often do you review the code of ethics with your accounting and administrative team? And the answers are a little bit different than they were for managers, which I thought was interesting. On the large-scale side, we actually see that they are reviewing the code more regularly with accounting and administrative staff. And that's real important. And one point to remember is that as PCAMs, and there's so many of you in the room today, as PCAMs, we're not just responsible for our own ethical behavior. We are responsible for the ethical behavior of anyone who reports to us or who we supervise. So it's very important to make sure that there's some level of education going all the way throughout the organization. All right, there's a lot of information on this slide, so I'm going to have to refer to my notes. And I know it's going to be hard for you to read all that information on the screen. But here's where we asked people, what did they include in their code of ethics? Primarily. And there was some consistencies in that both large scale and CEOs addressed things like gifts from vendors, confidentiality of information, both confidentiality of the information that's the property of the large scale or the company, but also the client information. Thought it was very interesting that more of the large scale managers noted that they had policies around confidentiality of company information than did CEOMCs. Not a lot more, but a little more. So I thought that was another very interesting component there. And of course, all of this information and detail will be included in the best practices report. So next we asked about not just the protocol, but the process. So what is the process that you go through if someone is concerned about an ethical behavior of either a board member or a coworker, or they've heard something. This is the first time the phone has ever rang at the front of the room. I don't know.
Board meeting, sorry.
So we wanted to find out how formal the processes had become. And what we found is that really at this point, although the Code of Ethics, having one and implementing one is important, not a lot of organizations have created an internal process for enforcement. It's still primarily left between the employee to go to their supervisor or actually going directly to the CEO. A couple of the companies have created an ombudsman internally and maybe an ethics committee, but most often or not, the direct report of a conflict or a violation of the Code of Ethics is done directly with the CEO.
All right, I'll get this right eventually here. Sorry.
Next, we wanted to know how the Code of Ethics was being communicated to the volunteer leaders. And so we asked how many actually did volunteer leader education on ethics. And of course, it wasn't really a surprise that the large-scale managers provide more education to board members and volunteers than did CEOs. CEOs still provided a lot, but you can see there's a little bit difference in the orientation of large-scale managers focusing that education on board members and CEOs on managers. Then we asked some why they didn't have a code of ethics, that blue group that we showed at the first screen. And number one, they say that they just used the CAI code of ethics, which we found a lot of people do. They used ethics of other trade organizations. This is primarily on the West Coast in California and Arizona, where there are other manager organizations. They just include them in their HR policies. Some they just don't have the time to do it. And I liked this one, that the culture in the organization was strong enough, as exhibited by senior management, that they felt they didn't need one. So the challenge with that model, I think, is that as long as you are a relatively small organization and can touch most of the people there, then that would probably work for you. The challenge is, as the organization grows, it becomes very difficult for you to rely on the fact that the people that you're hiring have the same value structure that you do, and there I think the risk is substantially increased. So that was really just one organization, but thought it was worth sharing. So the conclusions we can come up with: CEOs are focusing their ethical conduct policies on employee behavior, large-scale managers on board behavior. Both are increasing the content and having more education. So that's what we found from our survey. And now Sandy's going to share with you some of the steps that you can go through in actually looking at developing your own code of ethics.